In the sun-dappled folds of the ancient Greek countryside, away from the marbled opulence of Mount Olympus, one might find a man with ivy in his hair walking between rows of meticulously pruned vines. That man would be Dionysus. Yes, the god of wine, festivity, madness, and paradoxically tranquility. You likely know Dionysus as a wild reveler, the life of the ancient party. But what if the real Dionysus wasn't always dancing atop tables or inspiring frenzied ecstasy? What if, in his later myths, he chose the rural quiet of harvest festivals over the raucous feasts of Olympus? Let's go back not to the moment of his birth, which was already complicated, stitched into Zeus' thigh and all, but to his early wanderings. Unlike many of the Olympian gods who rooted themselves on the mountain, Dionysus was a traveler, a wanderer, a mythic drifter. And in his wanderings he found something most gods overlooked: peasants, farmers, and quiet rituals. The early worship of Dionysus wasn't grand. It took place not in gleaming temples but in olive groves, dusty amphories stored under thatched roofs, and in slow, deliberate chants sung by field hands. His presence was felt not in dramatic thunders but in the slow fermentation of grape juice, in the turning of seasons, and in the community effort of a successful harvest. What's fascinating is that Dionysus, though born of Zeus and Semele, wasn't immediately welcomed among the 12 Olympians. His status as an outsider persisted well into classical antiquity, and perhaps that's why he found comfort among mortals. While Zeus brokered wars and Hera meddled in marriages, Dionysus watched yeast rise and settle. Rural Greece, especially in the late Bronze Age and early Archaic periods, was far removed from what we romanticize as classical. Villages were small, connected by donkey paths and shared wells. Festivals honoring Dionysus began here not with ecstatic orgies, but with long, slow processions of wine-bearing carts and reed-pipe songs played under cypress trees. These early rituals were more agricultural than ecstatic celebrations of the harvest, not just the drink it yielded. Over time, these local traditions began to formalize. In places like Eleuthery and Thebes regions deeply tied to Dionysus, the god became a symbol of fertility and community rather than chaos. In fact, many of his rituals were linked to peacekeeping. Villages shared wine to settle disputes, and Dionysian festivals marked the beginning and end of seasonal labor. Wine wasn't just intoxicating, it was unifying. By the time Athens had evolved into a cultural capital, the Dionysia had become a formalized event, one of theater, song, and structured performance. Yet even here, echoes of the countryside remained. The city would bring in rural villagers, reaffirming that Dionysus belonged first to the fields. The idea of a theater, after all, is rooted in ritual spaces, not palace rooms. You may ask, why did a god like Dionysus, whose image is so often wild, choose to settle in sleepy villages and quiet hills? The answer may lie in the distinction between two types of celebration: ecstatic release and communal ritual. Olympus had plenty of the former. The feasts of the gods were loud, indulgent, and exclusive, but what they lacked was grounding. The gods feasted endlessly, but nothing ever changed. No seasons passed. No grapes ripened. No villages mourned a poor harvest or celebrated a good one. Time on Olympus stood still. In contrast, on Earth, people lived within time marked by the sun, the soil, and the slow work of fermentation. Dionysus, as a god of transformation, may have preferred this mortal rhythm. He watched the world change, grow, die, and be reborn over and over. Perhaps that was more meaningful to him than eternal feasting in marble halls. The countryside offered him a different kind of devotion, quieter but perhaps deeper. Rural celebrants danced barefoot, not for spectacle but in gratitude. Their songs were repetitive, almost hypnotic, echoing the slow churn of winemaking and the tedious beauty of tending vines. Theirs was not an audience of gods but of neighbors, generations bonded by sweat, soil, and shared cups. One detail often overlooked in Dionysian myth is his association with theater. While we remember the grandeur of Athenian drama, Its roots are in dithyrambs, choral hymns sung in honor of Dionysus during rural festivals. These performances were deeply local, even boring by today's standards. They weren't meant to entertain as much as to preserve memory, to ritualize the change of season, the loss of youth, or the anxieties of war. And Dionysus, sitting perhaps under a fig tree, listened. His later myths reflect this shift. Instead of grand epics, we find tales of him riding in a cart drawn by donkeys, accompanied by satyrs and maenads, not in madness, but in community. He didn't lead charges into battle like Ares or invent grand strategies like Athena. He listened to old women sing. He watched grapes wither in drought. He returned in spring. Even when offered a seat on Olympus, Dionysus remained restless. His country parties were not escapism, they were acts of participation, of embedded ritual. He preferred the honest uncertainty of mortal life over the static grandeur of godhood. There's a slow-burning question buried in this historical myth. Why did the god of ecstasy choose boredom, and was it truly boring to him? Or was he the only one who saw the divine in the mundane? By the time Dionysus fully entered the Greek pantheon, his image had undergone countless transformations not unlike the wine he represented. Once a wandering deity honored in humble groves, he now had temples, hymns, and an official seat among the Olympians. But what makes Dionysus fascinating isn't his acceptance by the gods, it's how little he changed for them. While other gods sought worship through military triumphs, dramatic interventions, or legal institutions, Dionysus was content with the small things: a vineyard well tended, a goat sacrificed in early winter, a song passed down through generations that no one remembered composing, and always the wine. To understand Dionysus' preference for the countryside, one must first understand how wine worked in ancient Greek life. It was not merely a drink, it was a method of preservation, an economic good, a sacred object, a cultural glue. More importantly, wine was local. Every village had its own version, its own method, and its own gods. Dionysus was not just the god of wine in the abstract. He was the god of your wine, the one your grandfather made, the one poured over your cousin's grave, the one diluted with well water before a wedding. It's easy to miss how personal this made him feel to the Greeks. It's tempting to think of Dionysus as the life of the party, but the party was often no more than a gathering of neighbors pouring from the same crater. They toasted their crops, mourned their losses, and welcomed guests. In fact, the very act of mixing wine with water, standard practice in Greek life, was a kind of ritual. To drink undiluted wine was uncivilized, even barbaric. To mix it properly was to honor Dionysus and acknowledge one's place within the human order. This small, measured civility was at the heart of Dionysian life. Even the famous symposium, a drinking party that modern minds imagine as wild and loud, was structured, philosophical, and surprisingly restrained. Reclining on couches, participants debated ethics, politics, poetry, and love, all while sipping wine from slowly emptied cups. These weren't drunken brawls, they were ritualized rehearsals of civic identity. And Dionysus was there in every cup, every pause, every silence between words. His festivals, too, had more structure than frenzy. Take the Anthesteria, held in Athens every spring. Though dedicated to Dionysus, it wasn't an orgiastic revel. It was a 3-day rite that honored the opening of new wine jars and the return of the dead. Children drank watered wine from special cups. City officials made offerings. And masks were worn not for theatrical effect, but to blur the line between the living and the ancestral. Again and again, we see Dionysus positioned as a god not of chaos but of transition. From one season to the next, from one life to another, from one identity to the next. His presence did not upend order, it helped societies cope with change. This brings us to a subtle but important point. Dionysus was not just a god for peasants and farmers. He was a god for the in-between. For migrants, for the socially marginal, for actors, women, and slaves, groups often left on the periphery of formal power in classical Greece. And yet they had a place in his rituals. They wore his ivy crowns. They sang his songs. In some regions, slaves were even permitted temporary release during Dionysian rites. Where other gods reinforced hierarchy, Dionysus offered permission to transform, to perform, to reflect. His rituals became social pressure valves, moments when society could invert itself just enough to avoid breaking. So why then do we associate Dionysus with madness? Part of the answer lies in fear. Rural traditions, especially those involving transformation, often made urban elites uncomfortable. To them, the countryside was a place of excess and unpredictability, where the old gods still lived and human behavior couldn't always be reasoned into neat categories. The Maenads women said to roam the hills in ecstatic frenzy were likely based on real rural celebrants who left the city during festivals to engage in dance, song, and ritual sacrifice. But to the urban imagination, they became symbols of uncontrollable female energy, threatening patriarchal order. Their rites, once local and deeply symbolic, became cautionary tales of what happened when people drank too much wine and danced without supervision. But to the people of the hills and fields, Dionysus wasn't dangerous. He was familiar. He was the god who walked beside them as they pruned vines and pressed grapes, who oversaw their autumn bonfires and listened to their winter laments. And when they celebrated, they did so not to lose themselves, but to remember something deeper, that life, like wine, was always in motion. You might be surprised to learn that even within his mythological stories, Dionysus rarely used violence. When confronted by pirates, he turned their ship into a sea of vines and let them leap overboard, transforming them into dolphins. When mocked by Pentheus, he led him into a slow unraveling, exposing the king's hypocrisy, not with swords but with masks and mirrors. There's a lesson in all of this, especially in how we tell stories. The loudest myths, the battles, betrayals, and booming thunderclaps are rarely the most lasting. It's the boring details that endure. The slow pour of wine into a chipped cup, the communal silence around a fire, the half-remembered hymn sung for the 100th time. Dionysus didn't leave Olympus because he was rejected. He left because the countryside offered him something the marble halls never could: change. While the other gods remained fixed in place, eternal guardians of order, war, wisdom, and sea, Dionysus kept moving. He changed and was changed. And in doing so, he became the god most like us. But that raises an unsettling question, one the ancient Greeks never quite resolved. If Dionysus is the god of transformation, and he walks among mortals not above them, where does the god end and the human begin? By the end of classical antiquity, the image of Dionysus had fractured into layers: rural guardian, drunken reveler, theater patron, and philosophical enigma. But beneath all of these masks was a constant theme. Dionysus belonged to the world of change. Not merely transformation for entertainment or madness, but the kind that creeps slowly, reshapes societies, redefines rituals, and forces even gods to walk unfamiliar roads. And walk them he did. Unlike Zeus, who thundered from on high, or Apollo, who stayed seated at Delphi, Dionysus ventured geographically and spiritually. His worship spread from the Greek countryside to the islands of the Aegean, into Thrace, Phrygia, and even further east. His rites were absorbed, adapted, and absorbed again. He became uncontainable. Yet even as his cult spread, Dionysus stayed remarkably consistent in one way. He remained human-facing. He appeared among shepherds and potters. He whispered to poets. He stumbled into harvest rituals and funerary laments. Where the other gods demanded tribute, Dionysus asked for presents. He required that you show up, mask in hand, story on your tongue, and wine in your veins, not to forget yourself, but to find something you'd overlooked. Let's take a closer look at a story that illustrates this: the tale of King Pentheus of Thebes. In Euripides, the Bacchae, Pentheus hears of women Maenads leaving their homes to dance on the mountain in Dionysus' name. Disgusted by this breach of order, he attempts to spy on their rights. Dionysus meets him in disguise, calm and composed, and suggests Pentheus disguise himself as a woman to sneak into the revel. Pentheus agrees, not because he believes, but because he's fascinated, disturbed, and slightly obsessed. As he dons the dress, he becomes something else, not quite a woman, not quite a king. He loses clarity. He is undone. Eventually, he's torn apart by the Maenads, including his own mother, who doesn't recognize him until it's too late. It's a brutal story, but Euripides doesn't paint Dionysus as cruel. He paints him as inevitable. Pentheus refused to acknowledge the god, refused to respect what lay outside reason and order. And so, Dionysus did what change always does to those who deny it. He rearranged the world until recognition was no longer possible. It's no coincidence that Dionysus is also associated with masks. In the city Dionysia, Athens, famed theater festival actors wore masks not only to portray characters, but to symbolically remove themselves. The mask wasn't deception, it was revelation. By wearing it, one could speak truths not allowed in polite society. Tragedy and comedy alike flourished under Dionysus' domain, not because he was funny or tragic, but because he allowed hidden things to emerge safely. Theater wasn't entertainment, it was medicine. As Dionysus matured in myth and cult, he became the patron of the misunderstood, the outsider, the actor, the immigrant, the farmer, the woman. His rites became liminal spaces where identities could be examined, tried on, and sometimes discarded. And these transitions were not loud. They weren't always dramatic. Often they were slow, seasonal, agricultural, like the way vines grow or how wine deepens in clay jars. Even his dual birth, once from a mortal woman, once from Zeus, made him liminal by nature, neither fully mortal nor fully divine. And unlike the other Olympians, Dionysus suffered. He was torn apart by titans in one myth. In another, he descended into the underworld to rescue his mother. He earned his place in Olympus not through lineage or force, but through endurance and change. And this, more than anything, may explain why Dionysus left Olympus voluntarily. Because Olympus was fixed, static, a gallery of eternal archetypes. Dionysus, by contrast, was a god of process. He couldn't remain in a place where nothing changed, where the wine never fermented, where stories never evolved. His realm was the countryside, not because it was lowly, but because it was alive. The rural festivals that bored the elite were sacred spaces to Dionysus. There, amid dirt paths and bleeding goats, truth fermented. Not just wine, but identity, survival, and the bonds of community. It was in the countryside that Greeks gathered not to conquer or proclaim, but to mark time, to remember, to let go. You may be wondering how this boring god of wine and wandering relates to us now. Well, consider this. In a world increasingly obsessed with spectacle, speed, and achievement, Dionysus offers something radically different: the sacredness of slowness. To sip, not gulp. To walk, not sprint. To reflect, not react. He teaches that the most profound transformations often happen in quiet fields, over long seasons, in the spaces we consider least divine. That gods are not always thunderous. That rituals are not always grand. And that sometimes, leaving the party is the wisest act of all. By the end of his mythic arc, Dionysus remains ambiguous. Is he dangerous or kind, liberator or deceiver, god or man? Maybe he's all of those things, or maybe the question itself misses the point. Because Dionysus was never about certainty. He was about the possibility that we might, even for a moment, wear a mask, raise a cup, and see the world not as it is, but as it might become. And that's why he left Olympus. Not because he was rejected, but because transformation can't live in places where nothing ever changes. In the crowded and glittering halls of Olympus, with its thunder gods, war goddesses, tricksters, and muses, one figure rarely makes a scene. She does not ride a chariot. She does not meddle in the affairs of mortals. She has no dramatic love stories or vengeance-fueled rages. In fact, she barely appears in most myths at all. Her name is Hestia, and her absence is her presence. While Zeus held the sky, Poseidon claimed the sea, and Hades brooded over the underworld, Hestia claimed the hearth, the fireplace, the flame, the center of every home and every city. Her domain, the mundane, the boring, the deeply human. And in this subtle, almost invisible role, she became one of the most essential gods in the entire Greek world. A goddess without temples, but in every home. Hestia's worship is unlike any other deities. She had few grand temples, no elaborate epics, and no military cult to spread her name by sword. And yet, no sacrifice, prayer, or meal began without her. Why? Because in ancient Greece, everything began at the hearth. The hearth wasn't just a cooking space. It was the warm, central flame around which daily life happened. Food was prepared, offerings were made, stories were told, and children were born, all under Hestia's quiet supervision. She was quite literally the center of the home, and by extension, the center of civilization. Each household had a sacred fire dedicated to her. When a new home was built, the flame was ritually transferred from the family hearth or the city's central fire. When colonies were founded overseas, as they often were in the restless centuries of Greek expansion, settlers carried embers from the mother city's Hestia altar across the seas, keeping that connection alive. In an age before postal systems or standing armies, this simple flame ensured that even as Greeks scattered across the Mediterranean, they remained symbolically united. And so, Hestia became the goddess of continuity, of civil order, and of the delicate balance that held Greek society together. She didn't fight for her throne, she gave it away. In myth, Hestia was a daughter of Kronos and Rhea, making her one of the original Olympians. She was among the first to be swallowed by her father and the last to be freed. This technically made her the eldest and the youngest of the gods, another paradox in a goddess full of quiet contradictions. When Dionysus rose to prominence and sought a place on Olympus, one version of the myth says there were only 12 thrones. Instead of sparking a divine war for space, Hestia stepped down voluntarily, offering her seat to the newcomer. She didn't disappear. Instead, she moved closer to the hearth, not a throne of power but a place of permanence. She chose presence over prestige. For the Greeks, this act wasn't a sign of weakness but of unshakable strength. Hestia didn't need to prove anything. Her influence was so baked into the rhythm of daily life that to challenge her importance would be like challenging fire itself. Her temples were fire, not stone. Most Greek gods had sacred temples filled with statues, incense, and offerings. Hestia, however, had no physical form, no canonical image, no elaborate iconography. Instead, her presence was symbolized by a flame often small, domestic, sometimes barely noticeable. In every Prytanean city hall, a sacred fire burned in her honor, maintained by appointed guardians or priestesses. When wars broke out, this fire was protected at all costs. If a city's central hearth went out, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a spiritual crisis. This is the kind of quiet power Hestia wielded. She wasn't prayed to in desperation or praised in victory. She was honored every day, often without words. You may wonder, why would an eternal fire be so important in a world of so many gods and powers? The answer lies in Hestia's role as the embodiment of stability. The Greeks feared not just war and famine, but disorder, breaks in continuity. Hestia's ever-burning flame provided a psychological and spiritual anchor in a world constantly teetering on the edge of chaos. While the other gods could destroy, seduce, or deceive, Hestia could be trusted. And trust in ancient society was perhaps the rarest commodity of all. Marriage, virginity, and the hearth. Hestia was also one of the 3 virgin goddesses, along with Artemis and Athena. But unlike them, her virginity was not militant or defiant. She wasn't defending herself against suitors or rejecting the norms of society. Rather, her chastity symbolized constancy. She was the one goddess who belonged to no one and everyone. By remaining unattached, she could be present in every household equally. In a world defined by lineage, inheritance, and patriarchy, this neutrality made her both powerful and approachable. When young women married, they made offerings to Hestia as they transitioned from their family hearth to that of their husbands. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a transfer of spiritual allegiance, a rerouting of one's identity in a new domestic world. Hestia witnessed it all, not from above, but from within. A world built on boring routines. Let's pause here. You've likely never read a dramatic myth about Hestia. She didn't throw lightning, she didn't cause the Trojan War, and she certainly didn't transform any poor shepherd into a stag. And yet her influence was everywhere. She is the goddess of stirring stew for the fifth night in a row, lighting a lamp before dawn, wrapping a child in a blanket by a warm fire, honoring the dead with a quiet meal, returning home safely after a long voyage. These acts are unremarkable, but they are the glue of civilization. What if Hestia's greatness is that she never needed a myth, that the absence of stories about her is the very point? Her power was boring, her role repetitive, her domain domestic, and yet without her, even the mightiest city-states would collapse from within. Because all societies, no matter how grand, ultimately rest on the small flame at their center. Yet for all her ubiquity, Hestia raises a quiet question that lingers like smoke from a morning fire. In a world that celebrates spectacle, who watches over the ordinary, and is that where the real divinity lies? We left off with a simple question. Is the divine found not in spectacle but in the ordinary? To answer that, we need to leave the home and step into the heart of the Greek city, the polis. And there, beneath all the noise of politics, trade, and military glory, we once again find Hestia. Quiet, burning, absolutely central. Though largely invisible in myth, Hestia's influence underpinned the architecture of Greek civilization itself. Let's take a slow walk through an ancient Greek city, not to marvel at its temples, but to observe how the hearth shaped everything from law to diplomacy, to the idea of what a community even was. The Prytanean, where cities kept their soul. Every Greek polis had a Prytanean, a public building often near the agora where the sacred hearth of Hestia burned eternally. This was not symbolic. This was literal. The fire had to remain constantly lit, carefully maintained by officials or priestesses, and tended with the kind of attention you might give to a newborn child or an honored ancestor. If it went out, it wasn't just a logistical failure, it meant the city's spiritual continuity had been broken. But what did this fire do? In legal and diplomatic contexts, the hearth of Hestia in the Prytanean had several crucial roles. Asylum. Supplicants and even criminals could seek temporary refuge at Hestia's hearth. To harm someone in her presence was taboo effectively. The hearth acted as a sacred pause button on violence. Diplomatic sanctuary. Ambassadors and foreign guests were often received at the hearth. It was considered the safest and most honorable place to begin discussion. Sitting by Hestia's fire meant you were under the city's protection, no matter who you were. Continuity during war. If a city fell or was abandoned, citizens would carry fire from Hestia's hearth to preserve their civic soul. The city, even if burned, was not truly lost if the flames survived. Thus, Hestia was not simply the goddess of domestic warmth, she was the symbol of political identity. She represented the polis in its most essential, elemental form. We often forget that before there were walls, armies, and laws, cities were built around fires. The hearth came first, governance came second. Colonies and the flame of origin. During the great colonization movements of the 8th to 6th centuries BCE, Greek city-states sent expeditions across the seas to Italy, North Africa, the Black Sea, and beyond. These were bold, risky undertakings. They involved loss, hardship, and uncertain futures. And yet, what did these settlers carry first? Embers. Colonists would take flame from their mother city's prytaneion and keep it burning through the journey. When they arrived at the new site, the first thing they did was reignite Hestia's fire, the literal and spiritual transplant of the city's identity. In this way, the new city wasn't entirely new, it was a continuation, a living extension of the old. The connection wasn't enforced by military command or economic contract, but by shared fire. Hestia's flame became a diplomatic tether far more powerful than tribute or bloodlines. Even centuries later, these distant colonies would honor their ancestral fire, maintain shared festivals, and acknowledge the invisible thread of unity. It's tempting to say the Greeks worshipped gods like Athena for wisdom or Ares for war, but the deeper reality is that their society functioned because they understood where to begin. And for them, every beginning required Hestia. Ritual, repetition, and social cohesion. Anthropologists have long noted that human societies rely on ritual repetition to reinforce values and create cohesion. In Greek culture, Hestia sat at the heart of these rituals not by initiating dramatic events, but by bookending them. Every sacrifice began and ended with an offering to her. Every banquet began and ended with a toast to her. Every public festival acknowledged her, even when she played no role in the myth being celebrated. This ritual consistency made her a fixed point in a society that otherwise thrived on argument, philosophy, and flux. In a world where gods could be jealous, cruel, or changeable, Hestia was predictable. She represented the virtue of staying, of holding still. That may sound unremarkable, but in Greek society, movement and exile were ever-present fears. Cities went to war. Land changed hands. Political exiles were common, often lifelong. In such a world, the idea of a constant, a fire that never left, never judged, never changed was deeply comforting. And so, even if her myths are few, her appearances rare, Hestia was remembered at every meal, every vote, every funeral, and every civic celebration. Her absence from drama was not a mistake, it was her message. The paradox of importance, being everywhere by being nowhere. We often judge importance by visibility, but Hestia challenges that idea. She is a goddess who appears in almost no epic poems, has no recorded oracles or prophecies, is never depicted in grand, emotional art, has no famous lovers, children, or rivalries. And yet her name was spoken millions of times a year across the ancient world in homes, in cities, on ships, in colonies. Why? Because Hestia didn't need to act. She needed only to be. In this way, she was a kind of divine infrastructure like the roads, wells, and aqueducts that don't inspire poetry but without which nothing functions. She is the breath before a speech, the pause before a prayer, the flame you didn't know you needed until it went out. And there's something radical in that. In a society driven by hierarchy and performance, Hestia offered a different kind of power, invisible constancy. She reminds us that being noticed and being essential are not the same thing. The lessons in her silence. The more you look for Hestia, the more you begin to notice where she is. She doesn't feature in the Iliad or the Odyssey. She's not invoked in Homeric battles or divine council scenes. She's not used to justify wars like Athena. She's not a tool of vengeance like Artemis. She's not a prize like Aphrodite. But that's exactly the point. Hestia is everywhere else. In the kitchen, at the threshold, in the flicker of firelight that never quite goes out. She's the ritual that doesn't change, the first stone laid, the last ember guarded. And perhaps that's why she was both so trusted and so overlooked. After all, in the very center of every Greek home on the hearthstone her presence burned. And it still burned even when the gods above argued, when the city walls fell, or when the world shifted. So the question becomes, what happens when the fire at the center goes out not just in homes, but in hearts, in cities, in civilizations? In the modern world, Hestia is barely remembered. You won't find her name in blockbuster movies about mythological heroes. She has no temples in Rome turned tourist attractions, no famous statues in European museums. Even in ancient texts, she is rarely more than a passing mention. But for centuries, she was at the center of everything, quietly sustaining the rhythms of Greek life. The flame on every hearth, the breath before every prayer, the pause before every ritual began. So what happens when a culture forgets Hestia? The decline of hearth-centered culture. As the classical world gave way to empire and urbanization, first under Macedon, then Rome, the importance of the hearth as the center of communal life began to shift. In larger cities, especially cosmopolitan ones, public temples took on a greater role than private homes. Spectacle became more dominant than ritual. Gods with drama, military strength, or political relevance like Apollo, Athena, and Jupiter rose in prominence. Even in Rome, where Hestia's counterpart Vesta was venerated by the state, her flame became a symbol of empire rather than home. The Vestal Virgins of Rome were no longer humble keepers of domestic peace, but prestigious priestesses tied to the might of Roman identity. The hearth became politicized. And in this shift, the original meaning of Hestia was dulled. She had been a goddess of continuity, of quiet presence, of the small rituals that kept the world turning. But in the machinery of empire, the mundane was no longer sacred. It was logistical. It was forgettable. Homes became compartments. Cities became engines. Gods became figures of propaganda. The eternal flame, once central, became ceremonial. And in that transition, the ancient world may have lost more than it realized. Fire as a symbol of memory. Throughout human history, fire has been tied not just to warmth and cooking, but to memory. It holds a space, it marks a time. The phrase "keeping the fire burning" still resonates today, even in secular contexts. It speaks to dedication, to love, to continuity. In that way, Hestia's meaning lives on even if her name does not. And yet in modern life, we are deeply distanced from the concept of a central flame. Most homes no longer have a hearth. Meals are microwaved, not shared. Families scatter, cities buzz, and silence becomes scarce. We don't start days with offerings. We don't sit around firelight to tell stories. The home is no longer a spiritual center. It's often a pit stop. And this raises a quietly profound question. Have we extinguished our Hestia? The sacred boring, reclaiming the ordinary. There is a danger in forgetting the boring parts of history. We celebrate the warriors, the poets, the revolutionaries. But civilizations are built and, more importantly, sustained by repetition, by quiet devotion, by small acts repeated over generations. Hestia is a reminder that the ordinary is sacred. That baking bread, sweeping a floor, lighting a lamp, these are not just chores. They are rituals, acts of care, anchors. In a world addicted to novelty, Hestia asks us to stay. Stay present. Stay grounded. Stay connected. She doesn't need temples. She asks only that we notice her where she's always been, in the center of our lives. Hestia in disguise, modern echoes. Though her name faded, Hestia left fingerprints everywhere. In Jewish tradition, the Ner Tamid, eternal flame, burns in every synagogue, a continuous light symbolizing divine presence. In Christian churches, votive candles burn in quiet corners, lit by the faithful in hopes and remembrance. In Eastern practices, daily offerings at home altars maintain spiritual presence, even when no public ceremony is held. Even in secular life, We light candles on birthdays, keep kitchen tables sacred for meals, and use the word hearth to invoke the warmth of home even if there is no literal fire. These are all remnants of a Hestia-shaped worldview, one in which the center matters, even when it's not seen, one in which a small flame can still mean everything. Final reflections, a God we need again. As the ancient world fades in our rearview mirror, we often look back for lessons. And while the loudest stories of wars, gods, and heroes draw the most attention, perhaps it's the quietest ones that hold the deepest wisdom. Hestia didn't demand, she didn't punish, she didn't even leave. She just stayed. Her myth may be boring, her story may be simple, but her message is enduring. There is power in presence. There is strength in routine. There is holiness in the ordinary. As we race through modern life, constantly chasing the next innovation, maybe we would do well to pause and remember the stillness of the hearth, the center that doesn't seek attention but offers warmth all the same. Because in the end, civilizations don't fall when they lose their wars. They fall when they forget their centers. And so we close the story of Hestia not with a bang, but with a question. If a flame once lit every home, and we no longer tend it, what burns at the center now? You may know Hermes as the messenger god, the wing-footed traveler between Olympus, Earth, and the underworld. He carries news, delivers souls, and even helps the occasional hero cheat the rules. Quick-witted and clever, he's often cast as a trickster, a rogue, a guide. But behind the tales of stolen cattle and clever negotiations lies another side to Hermes, the god of systems. In a world governed by chaotic gods, it was Hermes who built the invisible infrastructure of movement, communication, trade, and record-keeping. In short, he was the bureaucrat of the gods. And unlike Dionysus or Ares, who lived for chaos and conflict, Hermes made sure everything arrived where it needed to go. From trickster to clerk, the dual life of Hermes. It's easy to dismiss Hermes as a mythological prankster. His earliest myth involves him stealing Apollo's cattle as a newborn and pretending nothing happened. He hides the evidence with cunning, invents the liar along the way, and somehow ends up charming his older brother into forgiveness. But this isn't just a cute tale of mischief. It's a story about control through cleverness. Hermes didn't use strength or status to get what he wanted. He used systems. Even as a baby, he was tracking paths through the wilderness, masking trails with reversed footprints, inventing new tools and categories of items, negotiating deals across different parties. In other words, Hermes was organizing chaos. Even in mischief, he was inventing order. As he matured into his role on Olympus, this talent for organization evolved into something vital. The gods needed a liaison, someone who could move between realms and manage the delicate flow of information. Hermes became that bridge not just between gods and humans, but between all domains. And like any good bureaucrat, he kept the receipts, commerce contracts, and the invention of accountability. Hermes wasn't only a divine messenger, he was also the patron of merchants, traders, bankers, and messengers. In other words, everyone who had to track things across distance and time. In the bustling agoras of Athens or Corinth, statues of Hermes stood near market stalls not as decoration, but as divine oversight. He presided over trade negotiations, weights and measures, verbal contracts and written ledgers, shipping manifests and travel documentation. In fact, ancient Greeks believed that Hermes invented numbers and writing, the very tools required for record-keeping. Before coins and commerce, trust was managed through ritual and reputation. But as the Greek world expanded, personal trust was no longer enough. You needed records, marks, agreements, systems. Hermes became the spiritual authority over honest transactions. And in a world without banks, receipts, or courts as we know them, Divine oversight mattered. Invoking Hermes during a deal was not unlike notarizing a document today. It added weight. Even when cheating occurred, Hermes wasn't necessarily offended. He was, after all, a trickster, but he expected consistency, cleverness, and a working system. And that's what made him the perfect god for bureaucrats. The god of boundaries, literal and metaphorical. Hermes' presence was marked not only by statues, but by Hermes stone markers placed at crossroads, doorways, and property lines. These weren't just milestones. They were boundary managers. Boundaries mattered deeply in the Greek world. Between city and wild. Between home and stranger. Between life and death. Hermes existed on all of these edges. He didn't enforce borders with violence. He acknowledged them, managed them, and allowed things to pass safely across. And this is where Hermes becomes more than a courier. He becomes a facilitator of movement, not just physically, but socially and spiritually. He governed the rules of transition. If you were traveling, he was invoked. If you were entering someone's home, he was honored. If a soul left the body, Hermes escorted it quietly, respectfully into the realm of Hades. In bureaucratic terms, he wasn't just a messenger, he was customs and border control, internal affairs, and the census office rolled into one. He knew who belonged where, what needed to go where, and what rules must be followed to keep it all from unraveling. The temple of systems, Hermes in daily life. Unlike gods who ruled thunder or oceans, Hermes ruled things that were easy to overlook, and yet they were everywhere. In every receipt stamped with a seal, in every message carried across cities, in every trail walked by a courier, in every document signed with a name. In the city-state, where legal disputes and economic activity grew increasingly complex, Hermes was essential. Even in households, Hermes was called upon before journeys, deliveries, or legal declarations. He wasn't prayed to with grand hymns or emotional pleas. He was invoked in the margins, quietly, like the way you double-check an address before mailing a letter. And this was his genius. Hermes was not a god of power. He was a god of flow, of the movement of information, goods, souls, boundaries, and understanding. In modern terms, he wasn't just divine. He was logistics. And logistics, while boring, make everything possible. The systems we forget we rely on. You've likely never thanked Hermes. But every time you've sent a message, signed a contract, crossed a border, or relied on a schedule, you've participated in his domain. He was the god of boring necessities, and perhaps the only god who could function in both heaven and hell, precisely because he belonged to neither. He didn't dominate, he coordinated. And in doing so, Hermes offered a different kind of divinity, not one based on strength or wisdom, but on clarity. Because sometimes, the most powerful forces in the world are the ones that move quietly, keep records, show up on time, and know exactly who needs to be where. But that leaves us with a curious thought. What happens when no one tracks the systems anymore? When the flows get tangled, the records forgotten, and the messengers stop running? In the last section, we met Hermes not as the carefree prankster or heroic helper of myth, but as something far more essential, the divine administrator. As the Greek world expanded, cities growing, trade routes multiplying, legal systems evolving, it wasn't strength or poetry that kept everything working. It was systems. And behind every system, there was Hermes, the first mail carrier, messages, errors, and the risk of delay. In the ancient Greek world, there was no postal service as we know it today. No stamps, no envelopes, no mailboxes. If you wanted to send a message, you needed a scribe to record it if it was written, a runner or sailor to deliver it, a system of trust to ensure it arrived. Enter Hermes, As Hermes Enodio's Hermes of the Roads, he was invoked at every stage of this process. His role wasn't just symbolic. Messengers carved his name into their walking staffs. Merchants scrawled his symbol onto wax tablets. If the message got there safely, thanks were owed to Hermes. If not, it was assumed he had been slighted. Even in the most bureaucratic empires, Persia, later Rome, where postal networks were more formalized, Greek cities retained the belief that Hermes governed the risk of communication. What if the message was intercepted? What if it was misunderstood? What if the bearer was bribed or waylaid? In all these uncertainties, Hermes stood as the liminal presence between sender and receiver. Not because he guaranteed perfect delivery, but because he acknowledged the possibility of error. In this way, Hermes didn't promise a flawless system. He promised a functional one. One where failure was possible, and therefore systems had to be flexible. Legal protections, seals, contracts, and the god of the fine print. Commerce in the Greek world was not as informal as we might imagine. It relied on contracts, sometimes oral, often written. These agreements governed the sale of goods, maritime trade insurance, real estate transfers, marriage dowries, slave ownership, manumission terms. To modern ears, these may seem like standard legal topics, but to the ancient Greeks, they were acts of great ritual and social risk. Entering into a contract meant exposing oneself to debt, failure, and public shame. So how did they mitigate this risk? They invoked Hermes. It was common to begin contracts with the phrase, "In the presence of Hermes and the gods." And sometimes, small statuettes of Hermes were kept in offices or marketplaces, silent witnesses to the terms being agreed upon. Hermes wasn't the god of law that was Themis, or sometimes Zeus in his judicial form. Instead, Hermes governed compliance, the practical reality of what happens after you sign. Did you deliver the cargo? Did you meet the repayment schedule? Did the other party vanish? Hermes didn't punish, he reminded. He nudged. He oversaw the movement of obligation. Weights and measures, the small gods of accuracy. In many Greek agoras, marketplaces, Hermes was pictured beside or above the official weights and measures bench. This is because, in addition to being the god of travel and communication, he was the god of fairness in exchange. When two people exchanged goods, the scales had to be balanced. If they weren't, fraud was assumed and the gods were not pleased. A crooked merchant risked not just bad reputation, but spiritual consequence. Hermes didn't demand perfection. He demanded honest systems. There's evidence that traveling inspectors carried small icons of Hermes with them, or swore oaths in his name before confirming weights. In this way, Hermes became an early symbol of regulatory oversight. It's telling that even as coins spread, each marked with the iconography of city-states, many of them bore Hermes' winged staff or helmet, especially in regions where trade was a major force. He was a divine seal of quality control, at a time when the line between sacred and practical was blurred. Travel permits, boundaries, and the god of transit. Another overlooked but essential domain of Hermes, travel logistics. Movement in ancient Greece was not easy. Travel between cities required proper timing to avoid war zones or hostile terrain. Knowledge of routes, there were no maps as we know them. Local permission or introductions, strangers were often treated with suspicion. In this environment, Hermes became the cosmic passport. Travelers would mark his statues with oil or flowers before departing. Some carried carved tokens with his name, especially sailors crossing into foreign ports. Even within cities, moving across thresholds had ritual implications. Hermes presided over entrances, crossroads, and doorsteps. This wasn't decorative, it was spiritual infrastructure. Every time someone moved across a line, through a gate, over a border, they were engaging with the domain of Hermes. And in doing so, they reaffirmed the value of process. It's no wonder the Romans adopted him into their pantheon as Mercury, and tied him not just to messages, but to commerce, boundaries, and the movement of capital. In many ways, Hermes was the world's first project manager. So what did his bureaucracy look like? If you imagine Olympus as a divine court or business, Hermes was the COO, managing daily logistics; the communications director, relaying strategy; the legal liaison, ensuring compliance; the messenger, handling crisis updates; the transition manager, escorting souls between life and death. He kept things moving. While other gods dealt with permanence, eternal truths, immortal wars, Hermes specialized in flux. He understood that systems must bend, adapt, and above all communicate. Even when the system broke, Hermes knew how to improvise. He was not the god of order for order's sake. He was the god of functional order, of elegant chaos, of bureaucracy that works. Which begs the question: in a world that keeps getting faster, more complex, and more digital, who plays the role of Hermes now? Who ensures that what we say is heard, that what we send is received, that what we promise is remembered? By now, we've seen Hermes not as a winged novelty or a mischievous footnote to more dramatic myths, but as something far more important: the divine embodiment of systems. He kept contracts sacred, guided messages safely, marked boundaries both physical and social, and ensured that people, goods, and souls moved where they were supposed to. He was the patron of passage between places, people, and moments in time. But what happens when the messenger fails? What happens when systems lose their messenger god? This final section explores the collapse of order not through violence, but through the quiet failure of communication. A breakdown not in belief, but in process. And in that slow erosion, we begin to understand why bureaucracy, boring, repetitive, fragile, is often the last thing holding a society together. When the network breaks, in the late classical and early Hellenistic periods, Greek city-states began to fracture under the weight of complexity. Empires rose: Macedonian, Seleucid, Roman, each introducing their own administrative systems, trade policies, and laws. The once communal networks of Hermes, the silent mutual agreements across agora stalls and harbor stones, were replaced with imperial bureaucracy, larger, colder, and not nearly as divine. In this new order, the personalized role of Hermes began to fade. Messages were now delivered by imperial couriers. Contracts were overseen by magistrates. Border rituals were replaced with military checkpoints. Religious tokens gave way to official seals. And yet something was lost. Because Hermes didn't just represent logistics, he represented trust. When Hermes was invoked, it wasn't just a transaction. It was a ritual of faith that both parties believed in the same gods, the same values, and the same shared story. Without Hermes, systems became efficient but brittle. They no longer carried spiritual weight, and in time, they fractured under their own ambition. The human cost of forgotten systems. For most ancient people, life depended not on grand philosophies or battlefield victories, but on whether the system still worked. Would the grain arrive before the port closed? Would the contract be honored if the magistrate changed? Would the courier remember to pass the message along in a storm? Hermes had once stood in those fragile gaps, not preventing failure, but ensuring that most of the time, for most people, things moved as expected. Without him, those gaps widened. Empires still functioned, but trust thinned. Communication became formal but cold. Commerce became profitable but impersonal. And it's in this subtle shift that Hermes becomes more than a god. He becomes a symbol of civic care. He reminds us that bureaucracy is not inherently oppressive. At its best, It is an act of service, a system of care designed to move things forward with fairness, accuracy, and dignity. It is only when we forget this, when we strip systems of trust and intention, that they become prisons. Hermes Psychopompos, The Final Crossing. Perhaps the most haunting title Hermes held was Psychopompos' Guide of Souls. It was he who met the dying at the threshold and walked them gently to the underworld. He did not judge them, that was Hades' task. Hermes only delivered. In this role he wasn't winged and sprightly. He was calm, quiet, patient. To the Greeks, death was not a journey of violence, but of administration. It required a guide who could handle transitions with grace. And again, we see Hermes as the facilitator of change, not the arbiter of outcome. He appeared in that strange space between breath and silence, between life and whatever comes next. Even here, he was not absent. He was the cosmic paper pusher, ensuring that things, souls, words, messages got where they were going. That may seem unromantic, but to a civilization that feared disorder more than death, it was sacred. The wisdom of the margins. Hermes teaches us that the most essential parts of society often live in the margins. In the person who carries news, not just makes it. In the one who prepares the stage, not stars on it. In the clerk who files the record, not the one who breaks it. In the soul who guides, rather than leads. He shows us that without the messenger, the message dies. Without the boundary marker, communities clash. Without the contract, trust collapses. And without someone to mind the details, nothing holds together. His absence in myth is almost never acknowledged, but in life, you know it when things fall apart. When bureaucracy becomes hostile. When no one knows who to call. When systems grow so large, they forget why they were built. It is in those moments that we long for Hermes again, not as a god, perhaps, but as a presence, a reminder that somewhere, someone still carries the message. The messenger lives on. Today we have delivery networks, postal systems, internet protocols, cloud storage, legal frameworks, and customer service centers. We track packages in real time. We sign digital contracts. We move ideas across the world in seconds. And still errors happen, things get lost, systems fail. And in those failures, we remember why Hermes mattered. Because in every moment of breakdown, we are reminded that systems aren't just about efficiency, they're about meaning. When they work, they quietly affirm the world's stability. When they break, the illusion falls away. Hermes, the original bureaucrat, understood this better than any god. He didn't demand offerings of gold or temples of marble. He just asked that we care enough to keep the lines open, the paths clear, the records honest. That we carry the message and do it well. A final thought. Hermes is the god of small things, of boring things, of things we forget are sacred until they go missing. He doesn't need praise or spectacle. He needs only this. That we remember where we're going. That we deliver what we said we would. That we leave the path a little clearer than we found it. So ask yourself, what systems do you rely on that feel invisible? And what happens if the messenger doesn't show up tomorrow? In a pantheon of gods and goddesses whose powers roared across the sky and ocean, Demeter was a quiet force of nature, literally. She did not hurl thunderbolts or pull the moon from the sea. She was not known for feats of war, oracles, or seduction. Demeter governed a single, humble thing: grain. And yet by doing so, she fed civilization. When the world turned toward cities, writing, and philosophy, it was Demeter's domain, the fields, the furrows, the stored seed that made it all possible. You cannot build temples, vote in assemblies, or write poetry if you are starving. And so, while she is often remembered only through the myth of her daughter Persephone, Demeter's true power lay in something far more boring and far more brilliant: agricultural science. The original Earth economist. Demeter's Roman counterpart series gives us the word cereal. It's a fitting legacy, but it's only a hint of her full domain. To the ancient Greeks, Demeter wasn't just the goddess of wheat. She was the spiritual custodian of soil, cycles, seed timing, and harvest patterns, the whisper in the wind that told farmers when to plant and when to wait, the reason your children ate through the winter or didn't. And in her rites, we find clues that the Greeks understood something critical. The land must rest. Fields must rotate. Soil, like people, can be exhausted. In this way, Demeter was not a static earth mother. She was a dynamic systems goddess, deeply entwined with the rhythms of regenerative agriculture. While we tend to think of crop rotation as a modern agricultural innovation, evidence suggests that ancient farmers guided by rituals to Demeter practiced a proto-rotational system. How boring saved the world, fallow fields and rotations. The Eleusinian Mysteries, Demeter's most sacred rites, were held annually at Eleusis, near Athens. Their core myth was the story of Persephone's descent into the underworld and the seasonal withdrawal of Demeter's blessings from the land. This myth explained the seasons, but it also reflected agricultural practice. When Demeter grieves, the earth grows cold and unproductive. When she rejoices, the fields are fertile. But this wasn't just mythology, it was coded farming advice. Ancient Greek farmers believed that land needed time to mourn, especially after back-to-back plantings. This idea of allowing a field to lie fallow was embedded not in manuals but in myth. They didn't call it crop rotation, but the principles were there. Alternate fields each year. Rotate crops to avoid depleting specific nutrients. Plant legumes or leave the land resting to recover fertility. This knowledge wasn't universal or systematized, but it was widespread enough that Demeter's festivals often included rituals marking planting and harvest cycles, sacrifices made at key agricultural turning points, and processions to different parts of the land, indicating that each field had a specific purpose and rhythm. And this is where the boring becomes profound. Demeter was not worshipped in temples, she was worshipped in cycles. And these cycles were the invisible blueprint for survival. Women, fields, and the domestic agronomy of Greece. One of the most overlooked aspects of Demeter's domain is that it was primarily managed by women. While men fought wars and debated in the agora, women managed food. They stored grain, prepared seed, tracked seasonal changes, and ensured household survival. Demeter, unlike Hera or Aphrodite, was not a goddess of emotion or aesthetics. She was a goddess of utility. Her rituals were enacted by women who knew when to thresh and when, managed how much seed to save for next season, taught their daughters how to bake, ferment, and preserve, understood the weight of an early frost. This was a kind of hidden science, passed down not in books but in practice. It lived in clay granaries and earth-toned songs. In the rituals of Demeter, you'll find hints of almanacs, calendar tracking, moon watching, rainfall measuring. And in this quiet agricultural tradition, women weren't just participants, they were priests, teachers, and scientists. Demeter's worship reminded everyone. Civilization rests on the knowledge of those who plant. The Thesmophoria, a festival of fallow power. One of Demeter's most fascinating rites was the Thesmophoria, a multi-day festival observed by married women, held each autumn just before planting season. It was a women-only event, sometimes involving fasting, sleeping on the ground, and ritual laments to Demeter and Persephone. At first glance, it sounds like a typical seasonal fertility rite. But the name Thesmophoria comes from thesmos, meaning law or regulation. This was not just a fertility festival. It was about structure, rules, and the moral order of planting. Here we see agriculture and ethics entwined. Planting out of season was disrespectful. Hoarding grain was punishable. Failing to let the land rest was spiritually dangerous. During the Thesmophoria, women reportedly unearthed composted pig remains sacrificed the year before and buried in pits. These remains were mixed with seeds to fertilize the next cycle. Is this dramatic? Perhaps. But it's also proto-composting, a fertility ritual grounded in soil science. And this is the brilliance of Demeter's cult. It turned boring farming knowledge into sacred practice, ensuring it was remembered. You didn't need to understand nitrogen cycles to believe in Demeter's grief. You just needed to know when not to plant and to pass that wisdom on. Grain isn't just food, it's politics. Demeter's influence also reached into the structures of economy and statehood. Athens, especially in the 5th century BCE, managed grain as a strategic resource. It was imported, tracked, and distributed through public granaries. Poor citizens received subsidized grain. Military expeditions depended on secure food supplies. Colonies in the Black Sea region were founded specifically to ensure wheat imports. And always Demeter was invoked. She wasn't just a goddess of plants, she was a goddess of stability. To lose a harvest wasn't just a tragedy, it was a threat to democracy. Without food, there could be no civic life. Without grain, no public festivals. Without storage, no security. In some ways, Demeter was the spiritual origin of state logistics, not through law, but through seasonal cycles that everyone observed across class, gender, and geography. A whisper in the soil. The brilliance of Demeter's myth is that it tells no one story, and yet it governs all stories about life, growth, and survival. She doesn't ride a chariot. She doesn't throw spears. She doesn't punish with floods. She simply withdraws. And when she does, everything begins to die. She teaches that nature does not need to be violent to be powerful, that neglect, forgetfulness, and exhaustion are enough to unravel entire cities. Which leads us to a haunting truth. The scariest myth of Demeter is not that she grieved, but that we might stop listening to her silence. In the ancient Greek imagination, gods shaped the world not only through dramatic interventions, but through ritualized routine, and Demeter, the goddess of grain and growth, was perhaps the most routine-driven of them all. Her power did not manifest as sudden miracles or thundering commands, but rather as the slow, rhythmic pulse of agricultural life. When her favor was felt, crops flourished, granaries filled, and life stabilized. When it was withdrawn, the world withered not because she struck it down, but because the cycle broke. In this section, we'll explore the deeper logistics of Demeter's world: grain storage, planning for famine, ritual sacrifice, and agricultural record-keeping. In short, all the boring, bureaucratic, brilliant things that ancient societies had to master if they wanted to survive winter. The granary, where grain becomes civilization. You might assume temples were the most sacred buildings in a Greek city. But for many communities, especially smaller polis, the most crucial building was the granary. Grain was not just food, it was currency, used to pay wages and tribute; security, buffer against bad harvests; social structure, determining who had power and who went hungry; civic identity, stored grain was sometimes held under the name of the city, not individuals. To ensure the grain remained usable, Greeks built pith, large ceramic storage jars, often buried partly in the ground to keep them cool. In wealthier areas, communal silos were managed by appointed officials, and in many cases, grain storage was accompanied by rituals dedicated to Demeter. These rituals served two purposes. They protected the crop, spiritually invoking Demeter's favor to prevent spoilage or theft. They reinforced community accountability, publicly affirming that food was a shared concern. In cities like Athens, grain reserves were tracked and reported. Yes, even ancient societies kept ledgers. Temple administrators and civic officials worked together to monitor how much wheat was stored, when it needed to be turned over, and who had claim to what. This wasn't just about abundance, it was about scarcity planning. And Demeter was invoked at every stage not as a benevolent fairy godmother, but as the stern guardian of civic foresight. Sacrifices and seasons, more than symbolism. We often think of sacrifice as a dramatic or violent gesture, a slaughtered bull or burnt offering. But Demeter's rituals show something more practical, sacrifices that were seasonal, strategic, and tied to real-world outcomes. For example, first fruits offerings were not just gestures of thanks. They were a form of crop sampling testing, whether the year's harvest was viable before committing to large-scale consumption. Spring planting festivals involved careful seed blessing rituals, suggesting communal agreement on when to begin sowing, likely based on moon cycles and historical records. In lean years, votive offerings of grain were made not in abundance, but in desperation. These were appeals to reset the cycle, to realign with nature's rhythms after a misstep. One particularly revealing ritual involved the burning of infertile seed, essentially removing bad seed stock from circulation, and offering it symbolically to Demeter as a form of atonement. While framed as divine appeasement, this was, functionally, quality control. These agricultural rituals weren't quaint. They were adaptive systems, ways to manage risk, share responsibility, and bind communities around survival knowledge. Scarcity as a civic crisis. When crops failed, and they often did, Demeter's absence was felt not only in stomachs, but in social structure. Hunger had consequences. Civic unrest, famines, often preceded political upheaval. Religious panic, priests were accused of angering the goddess. Migration, entire communities moved in search of more fertile land. Colonization, many Greek colonies were founded specifically to secure more reliable grain sources, especially in the Black Sea region. In Athens, shortages were taken so seriously that grain hoarding became a punishable offense. Laws were passed regulating how much grain could be stored privately, how much needed to be imported, and when communal granaries could be opened. Demeter was invoked in these laws not as a punishment figure, but as the ethical framework around which agricultural equity was judged. She wasn't a goddess of charity, she was a goddess of balance. If your granary was full while your neighbors starved, you weren't just greedy. You were undemeterian, out of sync with the cycles that govern not just nature, but society itself. Rural priests and boring mysteries. While the Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter are famously secretive and symbolic, most of her day-to-day worship came from rural priests and temple stewards who engaged in deeply administrative tasks. These caretakers were responsible for maintaining sacrificial schedules, tracking seasonal data, first frost, first bloom, rainfall totals, organizing planting festivals, managing grain redistribution during lean months, communicating with other polis during widespread famine. In other words, they were agricultural managers, not unlike today's climate scientists, agronomists, or food supply planners. And the success of their work didn't result in miracles. It resulted in predictability. That was Demeter's real miracle, stability in a chaotic world. When her cult worked, things didn't feel magical, they felt manageable. And that's something we often forget when looking back at the ancient world. Sometimes the goal wasn't glory, it was just another harvest that didn't fail. The hidden mathematics of grain. Though we have few surviving farming manuals from the classical Greek period, later Roman texts, like those of Varro and Cato, preserve much of what was already well established in Demeter's domain. From these and other archaeological findings, we know that farmers practiced field rotation, triennial or biennial fallowing. Seed quantities were measured and predicted based on prior yield. Storage loss ratios were tracked to prepare for spoilage. Harvest timing was calibrated to lunar and solar patterns. None of this would have existed without a shared cultural framework, a system of memory, maintained by ritual, song, and seasonal practice. And who carried this system? Not scholars, not kings, but farmers, women, and priests of Demeter. They didn't call it science. They called it religion. But the results were the same: a functional knowledge base that let humanity plan, predict, and survive. The price of forgetting the pattern. As Greek culture evolved, as empires rose and fell, as urban life outpaced rural rhythms, Demeter's influence waned. Imported grain became cheaper than local harvests. Small farms collapsed into estates. Agricultural cycles were decoupled from civic rituals. And slowly, the knowledge embedded in Demeter's worship eroded. By the Roman imperial period, grain was something taxed, traded, and stored but no longer sacralized. The goddess remained, but the system she represented, that balance of cycles, respect, and restraint, was quietly shelved. We still grew food, we still stored grain, but we stopped telling stories about why the soil must rest, why certain seeds must be saved, and why not everything that grows should be harvested at once. And in that silence, the world changed. So here's the lingering question at the heart of this story. If Demeter taught us how to grow without greed, and we stopped listening, what kind of harvest are we sowing now? So far, we've seen Demeter not as a gentle abstraction or a grieving mother alone, but as the spiritual foundation of agriculture, food systems, and survival itself. Her power was not in spectacle but in timing, in knowing when to sow, when to harvest, and crucially, when to stop. Because more than anything, Demeter was a goddess who understood the power of absence. She knew when to let the land go quiet. And in doing so, she taught the Greeks and perhaps us that the cycle of life is not a line of endless productivity. It's a loop of growth, withdrawal, and return. When the land grieves, Persephone, pause, and seasonal memory. The story of Persephone, Demeter's daughter, abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld, served as the core myth explaining why seasons change. But beyond the allegory of summer and winter, the tale carried a deeper lesson. You cannot have growth without pause. When Persephone is gone, Demeter stops everything. Crops fail, trees wither, fields fall barren. This is not because she is wrathful, but because she is true to the rhythm of nature. You do not plant in grief. You do not sow when the land is cold. You wait, you mourn, you observe. This part of the myth, the sacred waiting period, was not just story. It was practice. Fields were left fallow, especially every second or third year. Farmers marked periods of seasonal abstention from planting. Winter festivals like the Halo and Lenya, linked to Demeter and Dionysus, celebrated dormancy with feasting, not sowing. Demeter's absence was a feature, not a flaw. It reminded people that even the land must rest, that every productive system needs silence. The political ecology of patience. In modern economic terms, patience is rarely rewarded. We value productivity, expansion, acceleration. But in ancient Greece, Demeter taught restraint as a civic virtue. Letting a field go fallow wasn't laziness, it was an act of devotion. It required planning for short-term scarcity, trust in long-term yield, community cooperation to share food during recovery years. If you planted every year without pause, the yield would eventually decline. The land would weaken, disease would spread, soil would compact, and nutrients leach away. Demeter's worship encoded this knowledge into cultural memory. She didn't issue commandments, she inspired repetition. Ritual became regulation. Myth became science. Waiting became wisdom. And it is this ability to embed ecological truth into sacred time that made Demeter's system so effective. It was hard to forget agricultural best practices when they were tied to songs, feasts, fasts, and sacred mourning. The echo of the hearth, Demeter and Hestia side by side. Demeter's quiet power mirrors that of Hestia, the goddess of the hearth we met earlier in this series. Both were stabilizers. Where Hestia governed the still center of the home, Demeter governed the still seasons of the soil. Neither sought glory, neither fought wars, neither demanded conquest. Instead, they asked us to pause. Before you cook, acknowledge the fire. Before you plant, acknowledge the earth. Before you act, consider the rhythm. This is not glamorous history. It is not thrilling myth. But it is what made life possible. Why the cycle broke, the erosion of sacred agriculture. By the time of late antiquity and the Roman Empire, the sacred rhythms of Demeter's world were being overwritten by efficiency models. Grain was treated as a commodity, not a communal blessing. Farms became estates, optimized for surplus, not sustainability. Ritual knowledge, once passed through the thesmophoria, was lost to time. Even the Eleusinian mysteries, once the emotional and spiritual center of the agricultural calendar, were eventually shut down under Christian rule, their rituals labeled as pagan superstition. The field no longer grieved, it just produced. And over time, the cost became visible. Soil degradation, widespread famine in rural provinces, increasing reliance on imported grain, political instability tied to food shortages. The system still functioned, but without meaning. Without Demeter. The return of boring wisdom. Today, as the modern world grapples with industrial farming, climate-driven crop failure, soil exhaustion, the ecological limits of monoculture, many are beginning to remember Demeter. Not as a literal goddess, but as a voice from deep time, a whisper in the soil. One that reminds us, regeneration requires rest. Excess is not abundance. Ritual is memory encoded. Food is not just fuel, it is history. In contemporary regenerative agriculture, crop rotation, fallow periods, and polyculture are making a return, not because of religious belief, but because they work. They always did. We just needed a myth to help us remember. A final harvest. Demeter's greatest gift was not wheat or barley, it was a worldview. One that placed value on rhythm, not yield. One that treated nature not as a resource, but as a relative. One that taught, when something precious is lost, don't rush to replace it, grieve, wait, and begin again. The Greeks feared the absence of Demeter not because of wrath, but because of silence. Because it meant the system had stopped, the order had unraveled. And so they marked time not in conquest, but in returning cycles. That's the real legacy of Demeter. A calendar made of soil and trust. A religion built on repetition. A civilization that knew when to stop. So ask yourself quietly, what cycle have you pushed too far? What field needs rest? And if Demeter came to your door not with thunder, but with silence, would you know how to listen? Some wars begin with thunder arrows raining from walls, swords drawn, horns blaring at dawn. Others begin with a boat docking quietly, an official being ignored, and a message not being answered for days. The Siege of Naxos, a largely forgotten, slow-burning military episode during the early 5th century BCE, falls firmly into the second category. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden betrayal, no mythological drama. Just boredom, logistics, tension, and the slow tightening of a noose around a city that dared to hesitate. This is the story of how an island tried to leave the Delian League, and how the very idea of freedom became a waiting game, a war not of swords, but of time, wheat, and whispers. Setting the scene, the Delian League's quiet grip. To understand the siege, we must first understand Naxos and its place in the Greek world after the Persian Wars. Naxos is the largest of the Cyclades, an island of marble, grain, and goats. In the aftermath of the Persian invasions, Athens had helped form a defensive alliance known as the Delian League. Officially, its purpose was noble: protect member states from future Persian aggression, maintain a fleet for collective security, share resources and ships for the common good. In reality, it became an Athenian empire in all but name. Member states like Naxos were required to contribute ships or money. Most, over time, opted to pay money, which Athens used to build its own fleet and enforce its own interests. At first, the arrangement seemed reasonable. After all, the Persians had burned cities. Cooperation was necessary. But decades passed. The Persians faded into memory, and Athens kept collecting dues. Naxos says no. Around 470 BCE, Naxos decided it had had enough. It wasn't a rebellious city. It wasn't powerful, but it was pragmatic. The Persian threat had passed, and Naxians felt their resources would be better spent on their own people than on distant campaigns dictated by Athens. They refused to pay. They did not declare independence with a dramatic flourish. They simply stopped cooperating. For a time, nothing happened. Athenian officials sent messages. Naxos replied politely but unhelpfully. Tribute ships didn't arrive. Scribes noted the absence. Merchants whispered. And then Athens made a decision. It would make an example of Naxos. Not by sacking it, not by massacring its people, but by surrounding it quietly and waiting. The siege begins with silence. When the Athenian fleet arrived at Naxos, they did not immediately attack. They set up a blockade. No one in, no one out. Fishing boats were turned around. Supply ships disappeared. Envoys were ignored. Rumors spread across the islands. Naxos, well-fed and self-sufficient, didn't panic, not at first. Its walls were strong enough to deter an immediate assault. Its fields and storage bins were stocked, and besides, the Athenians weren't storming the gates. They were just waiting. Days passed, then weeks, then seasons. And that's when Naxos began to break, not through violence, but through boredom, hunger, and fear. The politics of patience. The siege of Naxos wasn't about territory, it was about precedent. If Athens let Naxos go, others would follow. The whole league might unravel. But if it crushed Naxos too brutally, it risked alienating allies. So Athens played the long game. They kept their soldiers fed and idle. They rotated commanders to prevent dissent. They sent quiet envoys to other league members, reminding them, gently, of their obligations. And they waited. Meanwhile, inside Naxos, crops withered under pressure. Internal politics fractured. Food grew tight. Fear crept in, not of attack, but of never-ending siege. This was not a war of swords. It was a war of grain reserves, civic morale, and the erosion of autonomy. A civil siege. What made the Naxos siege unique was its internal unraveling. There was no climactic breach of walls, no heroic last stand. Instead, the city slowly turned on itself. Records are scarce, but what little we know suggests that. Factions emerged, some wanting to hold out, others to capitulate. Grain storage became politicized. Who had what? Who would share? Quiet deals were likely made, elite families, perhaps negotiating their survival, while the populace suffered. Athenian spies, undoubtedly present, whispered suggestions. Eventually, after what may have been years, Naxos surrendered. The exact terms are unclear, but they lost. Their walls, their fleet, their vote. They were no longer a member of a league. They were now a subject of Athens, all without a single major battle. Empire without war. the siege of Naxos became a blueprint for Athens. Why fight when you can wait? Why sack a city when you can starve it into agreement? Why declare war when you can enforce silence? This method of quiet dominance spread. Other cities noticed. Some complied preemptively, others resisted and paid the price later. Athens' empire, so often remembered for its art, democracy, and naval prowess, was also built on paperwork, tribute quotas, and waiting ships. And it all started with Naxos, a sleepy island whose only rebellion was to stop replying. So what makes this boring story so important? Because it reminds us that power is often maintained through boredom, that waiting can be a weapon, that wars of patience leave fewer scars but more silence, that systems collapse not with chaos but with disconnection, and perhaps most hauntingly, that the people of Naxos surrendered not when they were defeated, but when they were worn down. So as we end this first part, we ask, what happens to a city that gives up not to violence, but to time? And what kind of empire chooses silence as its sharpest sword? The surrender of Naxos marked a turning point in the ancient Greek world, not because of its spectacle, but because of its quiet efficiency. It wasn't a decisive naval victory. There were no great statues built to commemorate it, no poetic odes, no heroes or martyrs. And that's what makes it so important. Because Athens learned something dangerous. It could preserve its empire not through conquest, but through attrition. Through paperwork, patrols, withheld supplies, and strategic silence. This was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one that bored its enemies into submission. After the surrender, what changed for Naxos? Once Naxos capitulated, the Athenians took swift and systemic steps to reshape the city not just physically, but administratively. 1. The walls came down. This wasn't just a military precaution, it was a psychological message. You will not need these again. You are now part of a system that protects you, but only if you obey. By dismantling the city's fortifications, Athens made clear that Naxos was no longer sovereign. It could not protect itself, and therefore could not act independently. 2. Tribute reinstated, but now in cash. Where once Naxos had contributed ships or grain, Athens now demanded silver. Cash payments meant Athens could fund its own fleet without relying on other states. Naxos lost any direct influence in military matters. The transaction was clean, measurable, and enforceable. The economy of Naxos was now plugged into a centralized empire, its autonomy reduced to a column in a tribute ledger. 3. Clericies and oversight. Though not immediate, the pattern established at Naxos paved the way for a practice Athens would later use across other rebellious or strategic cities. Clericies. These were Athenian citizen settlements, small colonies, planted like bureaucratic outposts. They were not just settlers, they were informal inspectors, economic agents, and political pressure points. Even if Naxos escaped this fate in the short term, its surrender opened the door for Athens to normalize oversight, not as a punishment, but as a new civic reality. The role of boredom in imperial control. What's striking about the siege of Naxos is how little actually happened. And yet, a city was transformed. An empire was emboldened. A precedent was set. This is the power of slow tension. No one wakes up one morning deciding they're conquered. It happens over months, sometimes years, when rights are delayed, then diminished, then quietly revoked. In this model, armies don't charge, they encircle. Enemies don't die, they surrender out of exhaustion. Control is not seized, it is normalized. And this kind of empire building is especially effective when the oppressor is well-fed, patient, bureaucratically organized, and comfortable with waiting, which by this point in history Athens had become. The political messaging, fear through procedure. News of Naxos's surrender spread not through triumphal headlines, but through quiet implications. Other League members took note. They didn't burn the city, but they broke it. Naxos held out for a year, then two, then gave in. There's no recourse, Athens just waits. In time, tribute lists from the Delian League show no further open revolts for several years after Naxos. Why? Because the siege redefined rebellion. It taught cities that resistance wouldn't bring glory, it would bring years of slow decline, loss of trade, political fracture, and a surrender that felt not tragic but inevitable. Resistance by spreadsheet. By the mid-5th century BCE, Athens had moved the League treasury from Delos to Athens. It now managed tribute from all members centrally. What this meant practically: cities like Naxos were now line items in a budget. Their payments were expected on time. Shortfalls were recorded and investigated. Punishment came not with spears, but with auditors. We know from inscriptions that these tribute quotas were publicly posted in stone. Imagine that: a massive spreadsheet carved into a temple wall. And when a city failed to meet its quota, their name was visible. Their shame was shared. Their future actions watched. This is what control looks like when ritual becomes regulation. And the first city to suffer under this model was Naxos. The citizens' perspective: fear, fatigue, and forgetting. What did it feel like to live in Naxos during and after the siege? There are no surviving diaries or letters, but we can extrapolate from other historical sources and patterns. Fear of famine grew first, not fear of swords, but of running out of oil, bread, or salt. Divisions emerged, some citizens wanting to hold strong, others whispering about compromise. Religious rites continued, but with reduced offerings. Grain was too precious. Festivals lost their joy, no guests arrived, and processions became shorter. Young people who had once dreamed of citizenship in a free polis now joined the Athenian military or merchant system as employees, not peers. And eventually, people adapted. What had once been a proud city-state became just another node in an Athenian web, still Greek, still speaking its language, still celebrating its gods, but without the thread of independence that once held its stories together. Naxos fades from the map, but not the model. After its submission, Naxos largely vanishes from the front lines of Greek history. It's mentioned in passing in tribute lists, in naval rosters, in the footnotes of Thucydides, but never again does it shape policy or make waves. It becomes the first example of quiet imperial compliance. Its fate becomes a model. And models are powerful not because they are grand, but because they are repeatable. The legacy of waiting wars. Today, we remember the Persian invasions, the Peloponnesian War, the grand speeches of Pericles. But we often skip stories like Naxos, stories without battles, blood, or dramatic endings. But perhaps we shouldn't. Because the real machinery of empire, the boring parts, is built on stories like this. A refusal to pay. A ship that doesn't sail. A siege without swords. A silence that grows heavier by the day. These are the stories that change the world without making noise. And that's what makes them dangerous. So here's a thought to carry forward. What if the most effective form of control isn't violence, but waiting? Not thunder, but time. Not bloodshed, but quiet compliance. If history were only the tale of wars won and cities burned, Naxos would be a footnote. But in truth, Naxos was a blueprint. It showed that you didn't need to sack a city to subjugate it. You only had to outlast it, to wait longer than their stores would hold, to keep your ships patrolling, your ledgers accurate, and your envoys silent. This was the quiet genius of Athenian power, and Naxos was its first unwilling architect. Let us now trace what happened in the aftermath, not just for the island, but for the world that watched it fall. Because empires are not defined by their victories. They are defined by what they make others accept. From rebellion to routine. After Naxos surrendered, life returned to a kind of normalcy, but a new one, with new rules. Public assemblies still met, but any proposal had to align with Athenian expectations. Trade resumed, but merchants now paid additional dues to Athens. Civic festivals were held, but the city's wealth was visibly diminished. Youth joined Athenian projects as rowers, builders, or clerks, not out of ambition, but necessity. What Naxos experienced was not occupation, it was absorption. It wasn't conquered in a way that made headlines. It simply stopped being itself. A slow fade into administrative compliance. And once that pattern was accepted, every city in the league became more vulnerable to the same fate. The Delian League becomes an empire. The broader world learned from Naxos too. Other league members who had once questioned tribute or naval service saw what happened when one island tried to leave. And crucially, they saw that Athens would not be dramatic. There would be no invasions with burning torches, no temples toppled, just ships at the harbor mouth, men posted at supply lines, grain denied, patience enforced. Athens didn't need to conquer loudly anymore. It could govern through inertia. How silence becomes structure. Following Naxos, a series of similar incidents followed. Thassos tried to revolt in 465 BCE. A long siege ensued, this time with a little more blood, but the lesson remained the same. You could not escape the league without suffering slowly. Euboea, Samos, and Lesbos would all test the Athenian net. Some would do so through outright revolt. Others, like Naxos, would simply drift until Athens reeled them back in. But the tone of these conflicts was set by the Naxos model. Delay response, not trigger conflict. Send fleets, not fire. Wait for a city to need you more than it resists you. Then enforce terms quietly and permanently. Athens didn't invent this strategy, but it refined it to bureaucratic perfection. The hidden cost of control. But while the model worked, it came with consequences. As more cities were absorbed through silent sieges and forced compliance, resentment simmered. The League, once framed as a cooperative defense pact, had become a collection of subject states, each one quieter, less confident, more obedient. And Athens, though rich in tribute and power, became increasingly isolated in its own success. The soft tyranny of silent sieges was not immediately obvious. But in time, these unspoken injustices would lead to something louder. Athenian arrogance bred enemies. Cities banded together not just against Athenian power, but its method. The Peloponnesian War, decades later, would be shaped by this legacy, not just of tribute, but of unresolved silence. Naxos didn't cause the war, but Naxos was where the quiet empire began. Naxos in memory, what was lost. Today, Naxos is a beautiful island of marble, olives, and wind. Its modern quiet hides a deep history. But in the classical period, it was once a thriving polis with its own fleet, a trading hub, a contributor to early Greek art and architecture, a partner, not a subject, of Athenian-led defense. And then came the siege. And after that, its role in Greek politics disappeared. Its fleet was never rebuilt. Its name became shorthand for what happens when you say no to Athens. In truth, Athens did not destroy Naxos. It did something more permanent. It made future generations forget what Naxos once was. The empire that bored its way into power. When historians speak of empires, they tend to focus on Rome, Persia, or Britain, empires of roads, armies, and revolts. But Athens carved out something different, and in some ways more haunting. An empire that didn't look like one until it was too late. a power structure built not on conquering capitals, but adjusting civic budgets. A strategy that didn't kill cities, but starved them just enough to comply. The siege of Naxos showed that quiet power is still power, perhaps even the most effective kind. And once Athens learned that lesson, it never ruled the same way again. Echoes in the modern world. Though 2,500 years have passed, the Naxos model still echoes in modern geopolitics. You've seen it when trade embargoes are used instead of troops. Cities are economically pressured into silence. Small powers are absorbed into larger ones through bureaucracy, not battle. Autonomy is signed away with a pen, not a spear. It's the kind of power that says, "You're still free, just don't step out of line. You can govern yourself, just don't skip your payments. We don't need your army, just your compliance." It's not violent. It's not loud. But it works. And it started in many ways, with the quiet siege of a sleepy cyclotic island. A final reflection. The siege of Naxos is easy to overlook. There are no battle cries, no burned citadels, no dramatic betrayals. Just a city that paused its tribute, a fleet that waited offshore, and a people who, over time, gave up their sovereignty not in defeat, but in exhaustion. And yet from that moment, the shape of empire changed. Not through thunder, but through stillness. Not with swords, but with silence. Not with violence, but with waiting. So next time you read about a rebellion that never happened, or a city that used to matter, or a map that shifted without war, ask yourself, was there a siege? Or just a silence that went on too long? And who exactly decided it was over? In a city famed for philosophy, architecture, and democracy, it's easy to forget what really held ancient Athens together. Not just reason, not just ideals, not even its navy, but something much more ordinary. Olive trees. And not just as crops. Olives were sacred, symbolic, and state-controlled. So sacred, in fact, that by the 6th century BCE, the Athenian government had passed strict laws to regulate what citizens could say, think, or do about olive trees. Yes, even gossiping about them could land you in court. This is the story of how olive trees became so politically and spiritually loaded in Athens that the city outlawed opinion and created an entire legal structure to defend their roots. A tree worth more than gold. To understand why olive trees mattered so much to the Athenians, we must first understand what they symbolized. In myth, the city of Athens was named after Athena, the goddess of wisdom. According to tradition, she and Poseidon competed to become the city's patron deity. Poseidon struck the ground and created a salty spring or horse, depending on the version. Athena planted an olive tree. The people chose her gift, and thus she became the protector of the city. The original tree was said to have stood on the Acropolis, visible from all parts of the city. Its offspring descendant trees were scattered throughout Attica, rooted both in soil and in civic identity. These sacred trees were known as Moriae singular, Moria. They were not privately owned, they were state property. Their fruit, their oil, their very existence belonged to Athens itself. The law of the Moriae. By the 6th century BCE, under the legal reforms of Solon, Athens began creating detailed rules about the management and protection of olive trees. This wasn't agricultural bureaucracy. It was religious and political control. The Moriae were to be catalogued, inspected regularly by officials called nomos inspectors. They were considered sacred descendants of Athena's gift to the city. Cutting down a Moria without permission could lead to exile, seizure of property, or even death. Even ordinary olive trees had limited protections, particularly if they were linked to temple grounds or civic groves. In short, olive trees had rights, and citizens could be punished for violating them, even accidentally. Gossip as a crime. It wasn't just physical damage that the state sought to prevent. It was disrespect. Let's say you were a farmer in Attica. One day, you notice a Moria tree looks unhealthy, its fruit is sparse, its trunk diseased. You mention to your neighbor, looks like Athena's sacred tree isn't doing so well this year. You could be accused of impiety. You could be investigated by the Areopagus, the powerful aristocratic court in Athens. If convicted, you might lose land or be exiled, because even questioning the vitality of a Moria was seen as undermining the gods, the state, and the civic order. It wasn't a joke. It was treason by whisper. Surveillance through agriculture. This legal system didn't just protect the trees, it became a tool of social surveillance. The Nomons, the inspectors, were not just agricultural officers. They functioned like moral auditors. They ensured that landowners were not overharvesting from sacred groves. They listened for rumors. They could be petitioned by jealous neighbors or political enemies. This made olive trees a political weapon. Imagine being in a land dispute, and your rival accuses you of damaging a Moria on your land. You must now defend yourself in court not with your story, but with your loyalty to the city and its gods. Because the trees were sacred, any perceived disrespect was sacrilege, not mere trespass. Olive oil, state-controlled commerce. It wasn't just the tree that mattered, it was the oil. Athenian olive oil wasn't merely for food, it was used in religious ceremonies, exported widely across the Mediterranean, stored in elaborate, state-branded amphorae with Athena's image stamped on them. These amphorae weren't decorative, they were government-certified products. The state regulated where olive oil came from, how it was pressed, and even where it could be sold. Private citizens who tried to skirt these controls to sell oil without state approval or to plant unauthorized groves risked fines and reputational ruin. This created an economy where agriculture, religion, and law were deeply entangled. And at the center of it all stood the olive tree, silent and sacred, but surrounded by bureaucracy. The farmer's dilemma. So what did this mean for ordinary people? Imagine you're a farmer in the hills near Marathon. You've inherited a plot with a single Moria growing on it. You can't touch it without permission. You can't harvest it freely. You can't cut it down even if it blocks your other crops. If it dies under your watch, you may be investigated. If you speak ill of it, you may be accused of impiety. You now live not just on your land, but within the law's shadow. The tree is not yours. The fruit is not yours. The meaning of the tree isn't even religious anymore, it's political. And if you question it too loudly, well, that's gossip, isn't it? The root of fear. All of this sounds extreme, but it made sense in a world where civic identity was tied to divine favor. Agricultural cycles were uncertain and sacred. Religion and politics were not separate realms. To question a tree was to question the gods. To question the gods was to question the state. And if the state fell out of divine favor, well, crops would fail. Enemies would attack. Plagues might come. So the roots of the olive tree weren't just in the soil. They were in every citizen's mind. A culture of sacred bureaucracy. This wasn't just an Athenian quirk. Other Greek cities also had sacred groves and tree laws. But Athens turned it into a system. The inspectors had names. The penalties were codified. The amphorae were state-issued. The law was not just enforced, it was believed. Athens saw itself as uniquely favored by Athena. So to protect the olive tree was to protect Athenian exceptionalism. And to challenge it even accidentally was to challenge the myth that made the democracy possible. So what does this all mean? It means that even in a city known for reason, free speech, and democracy, there were limits. Not just on what you could do, but on what you could say. And sometimes, the line between citizen and criminal was drawn not with weapons, but with roots, branches, and rumors. So as we end this first section, ask yourself, what kind of society builds its legal system around a tree? And what happens to truth when even noticing the health of a branch becomes dangerous? In Athens, a tree wasn't just a tree. It was a witness, a weapon, and a warning. And if you lived near one of Athena's sacred moriae, you lived with constant risk. In this section, we go deeper into the bureaucratic and cultural infrastructure Athens built around its olive trees. You'll see how laws became tools, how gossip became evidence, and how ordinary Athenians learned to navigate survival under sacred surveillance. Because the true story of the moriae isn't just about religion. It's about how states maintain control, even through something as quiet as a grove of trees. The moriae system, state-owned, spirit-touched. As noted in Section 1, moriae were olive trees considered descendants of the original tree gifted by Athena. But they were more than myth, they were identified, registered, and documented, inspected regularly by government officials, surrounded by custom, law, and fear. Here, how the system worked. Designation. Trees were labeled as moriae if they were believed to descend from sacred stock either spiritually, via the Acropolis myth, or physically, through propagation and location. Documentation. Officials kept catalogs of sacred trees. These weren't casual notes, they were state records, likely stored on wooden tablets or written on parchment in the city archives. Inspection. A group of men known as the letter 1F10 pi iota mu epsilon lambda tau alpha iota, epimeletai, or overseers, later called nomons, inspectors, were tasked with physically checking the trees, how they were faring, whether any had been harmed or moved, and whether the fruit had been tampered with. Reporting and judgment. If a moria was found cut down, damaged, diseased, or missing, an investigation was launched. Citizens could be summoned, neighbors questioned, and trials conducted before the Areopagus, Athens's ancient court for serious matters, typically homicide and religious offenses. In effect, a tree could trigger a felony investigation. And in some cases, it did. Real legal cases, the quiet drama of the olive trials. While records are sparse, we know from Athenian legal speeches and commentaries that people were tried in court for damaging olive trees. One particular case, now lost, but referenced by later scholars, described a landowner accused of digging up a moria during plowing. His defense: "I didn't know it was a moria, I thought it was wild." That defense didn't hold. Athenians were expected to know their land, know their trees, and know the law. Ignorance was no excuse. In another case, a man was prosecuted for failing to report a diseased moria on his land. The prosecution argued that this was equivalent to withholding sacred information from the state, a form of impiety. Convictions in these cases could lead to large fines measured in drachmae, often equivalent to months of income; loss of citizen rights, called atimia; exile, temporary or permanent, especially if the offense was considered sacrilegious; land seizure, especially if the tree had been removed to make room for private expansion; a weaponized bureaucracy. Here, where it gets more disturbing, moria law became a tool of manipulation. Let's say you wanted to force a land dispute, undermine a rival's reputation, punish someone politically. All you had to do was accuse them of harming or insulting a moria. And because there was no easy way to disprove such a claim, and because inspectors could be bribed or pressured, the court could be swayed. This weaponization of the sacred system wasn't common, but it was known. It appears in comedy, satire, and even political rhetoric. Careful with that shovel, or you'll be called a Moria murderer. Better worship the tree, not your gods. He doesn't plant olives, he plants lawsuits. And so Athenians learned to fear their own trees. Everyday anxiety, life under tree law. Imagine being a smallholder owning a tiny farm with just a few olive trees, one of which is designated a Moria. Here, what your daily life now included. You could not prune that tree without authorization. You couldn't build too close to it. You had to ensure it was well kept, but not harvested. You had to allow inspectors and possibly neighbors onto your land to observe it. If something went wrong, lightning, illness, drought, you were still accountable. The sacred tree didn't protect you. You had to protect it. And in a society where reputation was currency, even the suggestion that you'd been careless with a Moria could damage your standing. This turned private land into public responsibility. Olive trees in Athenian religion and symbolism. It wasn't all anxiety, though. For many Athenians, Morii were not threats, they were proof of divine favor. Temple festivals often included offerings of olive oil, especially in large jars, Panathenaic amphorae, marked with Athena's image. Victors of the Panathenaic Games, a major Athenian festival, were awarded jars of this sacred oil. Olive branches were used to crown winners, purify altars, and mark sites of peace. To own land with a Moria could be a status symbol if you managed it well. But the stakes were always high, because even improper reverence could look like impiety. What was gossip, really? The legal system couldn't patrol every tree. So what kept Athenians in line? Each other. Whispers, rumors, and just observations carried power. If someone heard you question the health of a tree or joke about Athena's gift, they could report it, or worse, repeat it. And the state didn't need to hear it directly. All it took was a complaint, a statement overheard at the agora, or an offhand remark at a dinner party. I heard his tree hasn't borne fruit in years. She said Athena's oil doesn't taste as sweet as it used to. They built their new storehouse awfully close to that Moria, didn't they? This was enough to launch inquiries or spark political feuds. In this way, speech became evidence. And speech about trees became evidence of loyalty or disloyalty. Why the state cared so much? At first glance, all this seems absurd. Why spend so much effort defending olive trees? But remember, in ancient Athens, everything was connected. Religion legitimized the state. The state enforced law. Law governed property. Property produced wealth. Wealth upheld military service, festivals, and democracy. If the Morii fell into disrepair, or citizens began to mock or ignore their importance, it would signal a larger breakdown. So the trees became a symbolic backbone of the polis. To let them go untended or disrespected was to doubt the gods, question the system, or challenge the myth of Athenian superiority. And no democracy, however bold, survives the erosion of its symbols. The olive tree as citizen. It's not entirely a stretch to say Athens treated its Morii like citizens. They were counted, documented, and defended. They had a legal status. They were immortalized in myth and art. Their well-being affected policy and public perception. In a world where everything sacred was political, the Morii became both boundary and mirror. And every Athenian, rich or poor, powerful or anonymous, had to decide. Will I revere the tree? Or will I risk everything for the right to speak freely about its branches? So the question remains, when a tree holds more legal power than a citizen's voice, what kind of democracy is it, really? By now we've seen how a sacred olive tree could ruin a reputation, trigger a criminal investigation, shape trade, religion, and politics, and quietly threat the very idea of personal freedom. But the tale of Athens, Morii, doesn't end with exile trials or suspicious glances at tree trunks. It ends like so many boring stories, with gradual erosion, reinterpreted symbolism, and an important question. What does it mean when a democracy chooses silence over curiosity about a tree, or about anything else? Let's close this story by examining what happened as Athens evolved, why the laws changed, or didn't, and what this bizarre legal regime reveals about how states preserve myths long after belief fades. The long roots, olive trees after the classical period. By the 4th century BCE, Athens was no longer the cultural and military superpower it had been in Pericles' day. The Peloponnesian War had drained its treasury and fractured its confidence. Macedonia, under Philip II and then Alexander, began casting shadows over Greek autonomy. Internal strife made state control more erratic, more defensive. Yet the Morii system persisted. We know this because later legal documents still reference penalties for harming sacred trees. Philosophers like Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle, described tree regulations in Attica in surprisingly bureaucratic detail. The Panathenaic amphorae with state-certified olive oil continued to be produced into the Hellenistic era. But something shifted. Where once the system was believed, it was now simply enforced. The tree was no longer Athena's whispered gift, it was just another entry in a civic ledger. And over time, Athenians, especially philosophers, began to question the connection between state power and sacred objects. The philosophers pushed back quietly. Philosophers in Athens had always walked a delicate line. After all, Socrates was executed in 399 BCE in part for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. So when later thinkers addressed laws like those surrounding the Morii, they did so cautiously but with unmistakable irony. In one surviving fragment, a student of Plato reportedly quipped, "The city watches trees grow, but not men." And in Theophrastus's treatises, we see passages that seem dry on the surface, listing tree types, soil needs, root systems, but between the lines, one senses a scholar fascinated and baffled by how much authority a society could invest in a grove. Still, even the philosophers didn't challenge the system directly, because they knew whether or not Athena's spirit still hovered near the Acropolis. The power of symbols endures longer than belief. A modern analogy: speech, symbols, and sacred ground. The Morii system might seem uniquely ancient, but it raises questions that are startlingly modern. What happens when certain symbols become untouchable, not by reverence but by law? Speaking about something becomes more dangerous than acting upon it. A community allows ritual silence to stand in place of honest dialogue. In ancient Athens, a tree was more than a plant. It was a boundary between religion and reason, between citizen and state, between myth and truth. Crossing that boundary by word, deed, or suspicion wasn't just a crime. It was a transgression of identity. And in many ways, we still live with versions of that today. We might not guard olive trees, but we do. Enforce silence around certain histories. Punish those who question the wrong sacred. Use bureaucracy to enforce tradition, even when belief fades. The Morii may be gone, but the systems they represent of quiet enforcement, symbolic loyalty, and legal myth still whisper through time. A city that listened to leaves. It's worth imagining, for a moment, an Athenian citizen in the 5th century BCE walking past a Moria on his way to market. He sees the dry branches, twisted and old. He remembers the law. He bites his tongue. He doesn't curse the tree. He doesn't praise it either. He simply walks on, eyes lowered, aware that even thoughts might echo. This is what sacred systems do when they're enforced by law rather than belief. They don't just control actions, they shape silence. And in that silence, a city slowly changes not with revolution, but with compliance. The olive tree's last word. So what became of these trees? Eventually, the Roman conquest of Greece in the 2nd century BCE disrupted many civic institutions. The inspectors faded. The laws lost their teeth. The sacred groves became farms again. And yet, even centuries later, Roman writers like Pliny the Elder refer to the unique Athenian olive oil with a tone of respect, confusion, and awe. The trees had outlived the courts, the inspectors, even the gods who inspired them. They remained silent, growing, uncaring long after the whispers had stopped. Final thoughts when trees govern speech. The story of the Morii is not exciting in the usual sense. There are no epic battles, no assassinations, no kings or coups, but it shows something perhaps more enduring, that a society's deepest control often hides in what can't be questioned. A tree, a law, a symbol, a myth, and in protecting those things too tightly, societies may begin to punish their own curiosity.